You are not a big spender. You know this about yourself. You have checked. You have looked at the transactions, reviewed the categories, compared the numbers against what you earn. The spending is not the problem. By any reasonable measure, you are doing what responsible people do. You earn, you save a portion. You maintain a balance that represents months of discipline. The savings account exists. The number in it is real, and yet the net worth barely moves. Year over year, the financial position is roughly what it was. The balance is slightly larger. The life is roughly the same. The discipline is real and the result is insufficient. And the gap between those two facts has no name that anyone has given you, until now. The money is not leaving through spending. It is being consumed by stillness. An engine that sits unused does not simply wait. This is the mechanical reality that most people have never been told about capital. And it is the entire argument here. An idle engine corrodes. The seals dry, the fuel degrades. The metal surfaces that were designed to move against each other in precise, lubricated motion begin to oxidize in their stillness. And the engine that looked intact from the outside has been quietly deteriorating from within. Not because anything attacked it, because nothing ran it. Your savings account is an idle engine, not a safe, not a vault, not a structure designed to hold value against time. An engine designed to run, generating return when positioned correctly, sitting still, corroding at a rate that the balance statement does not show you, consuming the purchasing power and opportunity that correct positioning would have preserved and grown. The problem is not discipline. You have discipline. The problem is not spending. You are not overspending. The problem is positioning. And positioning is a conversation that almost no financial content has ever had with you. Because the financial content you have been offered was built to sell you budgeting tools, not positioning clarity. By the end of this, you will not look at your savings account balance the same way again. Not with panic. Not with urgency. With the cold, structural clarity of someone who now knows exactly what their engine is doing and exactly what it should be doing instead. There is a specific kind of financial frustration that belongs almost exclusively to people who are doing the right things. Not the frustration of the person who overspends and knows it. Not the anxiety of the person who cannot make ends meet. A quieter, more disorienting frustration. The frustration of the person whose behavior is correct by every measure they have been given, and whose results are nevertheless insufficient by every measure that actually matters. You save. The balance grows slowly. The net worth does not move at the rate the discipline should produce. The explanation you have been offered, spend less, save more, be more disciplined, does not apply, because you are already doing those things. The advice is for a different patient. The diagnosis is wrong. The correct diagnosis requires a different question. Not where is the money going, but where is the money sitting? These are structurally different questions, and the distinction between them is the foundation of everything that follows. The first question, where is the money going, assumes the problem is flow, that capital is exiting through some identifiable channel, and that the solution is to identify and close that channel. This is the budgeting conversation. It is the right conversation for a spending problem. You do not have a spending problem. You have a positioning problem. The second question, where is the money sitting, assumes the problem is not flow but stasis. That capital is not exiting through spending at a damaging rate, but is also not being positioned in a way that generates return. That it is sitting in a structure that does not preserve its value against time. That the stillness itself is the mechanism of loss. Rockefeller had a specific and documented intolerance for idle capital. He described money sitting in a bank account earning minimal interest the way an engineer describes an engine running without load. Technically operational, practically wasteful, consuming resources without producing output. He did not believe in holding capital. He believed in deploying it. Not recklessly, structurally. Every unit of capital was evaluated for its position, what it was doing, what it could be doing, and what the difference between those two states was costing. The difference between what capital is doing and what it could be doing has a name. It is the cost of the idle engine, and before the three concepts that structure the argument are named, one reframe must be established and held throughout everything that follows. This is not a spending conversation. It is a positioning conversation. The budget is not the tool. The deployment is. Picture the engine, not as abstraction, as a physical object. Steel, machined to tolerance, designed to convert fuel into motion through a sequence of precisely timed events. Compression, ignition, expansion, exhaust. When the engine runs, each component performs its function in sequence, lubricated and cooled by the very motion of its operation. The running engine maintains itself through running. The idle engine does not maintain itself. The seals that require the pressure of operation to remain supple begin to dry and crack. The fuel that was formulated for combustion begins to oxidize and degrade. The metal surfaces that were designed to move in lubricated contact begin to corrode in their stillness. The engine that sits for a year looks, from the outside, nearly identical to the engine that ran for a year. The difference is internal. Structural, cumulative, invisible until the attempt to start it reveals what the stillness has done. This is the mechanical reality of capital held in incorrect position. The savings account balance does not change to reflect the corrosion. The number is the same number it was when the deposit was made. It is slightly larger because the interest accrues slowly at a rate well below the rate at which the purchasing power of the currency is being eroded by inflation. But the statement shows a number. The number is stable or growing, and the stability of the number is the precise illusion that makes the idle capital trap structurally invisible to the person inside it. The trap is this: the savings account is legible as responsibility. It has a balance. The balance is real. The behavior that produced it, consistent contribution, disciplined restraint, is genuinely responsible. And the legibility of that responsibility, the ability to look at a number and say correctly that this represents months of careful financial behavior, produces a satisfaction that functions as a signal that the mechanism is working. The mechanism is not working. The mechanism is idle. The satisfaction of the balance is not evidence of correct positioning. It is evidence of successful accumulation into an incorrect position. The crude has been extracted. The tank is full. And the crude is sitting in the tank, losing value through the slow structural deterioration that stillness produces, while the refinery stands at the gate waiting for an input that never arrives. Rockefeller had no interest in full tanks. A full tank is storage. Storage is not position. Storage does not generate return. Storage does not compound. Storage simply holds, and holding, in an environment where the purchasing power of currency is continuously eroded by inflation, is not a neutral act. It is a slow loss dressed as stability. The idle capital trap has three components, and each must be named precisely because the trap is only visible when all three are understood together. The first component is the inflation rate differential. Inflation is not an economic abstraction. It is a structural tax on idle capital, a continuous, automatic, invisible extraction that requires no transaction, no decision, and no awareness from the person experiencing it. Capital held in a standard savings account at an interest rate below the inflation rate is not preserving its value. It is losing purchasing power at the differential rate, the gap between what the account pays and what inflation extracts. At a 2% savings account rate against a 4% inflation rate, the differential is 2% per year. On a $6,000 balance, this is $120 of purchasing power lost annually, not through spending, not through any identifiable transaction, but through the structural consequence of positioning capital below the inflation threshold. The account statement shows growth. The actual position has declined. The engine is corroding. The gauge shows full. The second component is opportunity cost. Capital held in an idle position is not only losing purchasing power through inflation, it is foregoing the return it would generate in a correctly deployed position. The $6,000 earning 2% annually is generating $120 per year, while foregoing the $420 per year it would generate at a 7% return in a correctly positioned instrument. The opportunity cost is $300 annually on a $6,000 balance. Not lost through spending, not visible in any transaction, not recoverable by saving more or spending less. Lost through the structural gap between the position the capital occupies and the position it could occupy. This is the second form of corrosion, not the oxidation of metal, but the slow consumption of potential by the stillness of incorrect position. The third component is structural drift. Over time, capital held in idle position does not simply fail to grow at the rate correct positioning would produce. It drifts further from the conditions required for correct positioning. The bedrock threshold, the minimum quantity of capital required for the refinery mechanism to engage, for the compound engine to begin operating, is not a static target. It is a target that inflation moves further away from the saver who is not outpacing it. The person who holds $6,000 in a savings account at 2%, while inflation runs at 4%, is not standing still relative to the threshold. They are moving away from it. The effective distance between their position and the threshold is growing slowly, invisibly, in a direction they cannot see because the balance statement shows a number that is growing, not shrinking. The engine is idle. The corrosion is proceeding. The gauge shows full. This is the idle capital trap, not a dramatic failure, not a visible crisis, a structural condition, quiet, self-sustaining, invisible to the person inside it precisely because the legible signals all indicate responsible behavior. The responsible behavior is real. The positioning is wrong. And the gap between those two facts is what this chapter has named. The first chapter named the trap. This chapter shows the arithmetic of what the trap produces over time, because the idle capital trap is not a single period failure. It is a compounding one, and compounding works in both directions. The corrosion rate is not a metaphor borrowed from engineering and applied loosely to finance. It is a precise structural concept, the rate at which idle capital loses effective value per unit of time, calculated across all three components of the trap simultaneously: inflation differential, opportunity cost, and structural drift from the threshold. Most financial discussions present these three components separately, in isolation, as if they were independent costs that can be evaluated one at a time. They are not independent. They interact. And their interaction produces a compounding deterioration that is dramatically larger than the sum of the individual components would suggest. Here is the arithmetic, stated precisely: $6,000 in a standard savings account at 2% annual interest. In year one, the account earns $120 in interest. The balance becomes $6,120. The statement confirms growth. The responsible behavior has produced a larger number, but the inflation rate of 4% has reduced the purchasing power of that balance by $240. The real value of the account, what it can actually purchase, has declined by $120 in the first year, despite the nominal growth shown on the statement. Simultaneously, the opportunity cost of not deploying the capital at 7% has consumed $300 of potential return. This does not appear anywhere. It is not a transaction. It is not a loss that shows up in a statement. It is the return that did not compound, the base that did not grow, the engine that did not run. The total first-year cost of the idle position is not $120 of interest earned. It is the combination of the real purchasing power loss and the foregone return, approximately $420 of effective value consumed by the stillness of incorrect positioning. On a $6,000 balance, this is a 7% effective corrosion rate in year one. In year two, the corrosion compounds. The base has not grown at the rate correct positioning would have produced. The threshold has moved further away as inflation has continued. The opportunity cost compounds on the foregone return from year one, because the return that was not earned in year one was not available to generate its own return in year two. The engine that did not run in year one has not merely lost 1 year of output. It has lost the compounding return on that output for every subsequent year of operation. This is the mechanism that the standard financial discussion never names. Idle capital does not lose value at a constant rate. It loses value at a compounding rate, because the foregone return of each period becomes the foregone base of the next period's compounding. The corrosion accelerates quietly and invisibly behind a balance statement that continues to show nominal growth. Rockefeller described this dynamic in terms of what he called the second cost, the cost that never appears in the ledger but is nevertheless real. The first cost is what is paid. The second cost is what is foregone. Most people manage the first cost. They track spending, they know what they have paid for things. Almost no one manages the second cost, because the second cost requires not just tracking what has occurred, but calculating what has not occurred and what that non-occurrence is worth. The second cost of idle capital is the corrosion rate. It does not require spending. It does not require bad decisions. It does not require any active failure of any kind. It requires only the structural decision, whether deliberate or by default, to hold capital in a position that generates return below the rate of its effective deterioration. Now understand what the corrosion rate produces at the scale and time horizon that is relevant here. Over 5 years, the person who holds an average balance of $6,000 in a standard savings account at 2% against an inflation rate of 4% and an available alternative return of 7% does not simply fail to grow their position at the rate correct positioning would have produced. They arrive at year 5 with a balance that has grown nominally. The statement shows perhaps $6,600, but has deteriorated in real terms and has foregone a compounding return that would have produced approximately $8,400 in a correctly deployed position over the same period. The gap at year 5 is not $600. It is approximately $1,800 of real position. The difference between what the idle engine produced and what the running engine would have produced. At year 10, the gap is not doubled. It is compounded. The correctly deployed position has grown at 7% annually from an initial $6,000 with consistent contribution to a base that the idle position cannot approach, because the idle position has been compounding its own corrosion while the deployed position has been compounding its return. The corrosion rate is not dramatic in any single year. That is the structural property that makes it dangerous. Each individual year's deterioration is modest enough to be below the threshold of attention, below the level at which the discomfort of the loss would motivate examination and redeployment. The balance is growing. The growth is nominal. The corrosion is real and compounding beneath the nominal growth, and it will continue to compound for precisely as long as the engine remains idle. Not because the owner is irresponsible, not because the behavior is wrong, because the engine is not running. The engine has been described. The corrosion has been measured. The rate has been calculated. The compounding deterioration of an idle position has been shown not as abstraction, but as arithmetic. The specific calculable gap between what the idle engine produces and what the running engine would have produced over the same period, with the same capital, under the same conditions of consistent contribution. The question that remains is the only question that matters now. How does the engine start? Not how to save more. The capital is already there. Not how to spend less. The spending is not the problem. The engine is built. The fuel is present. The mechanical components are intact. The corrosion has proceeded but has not yet reached the point of structural failure. The position is recoverable. The gap is closable. The compounding that has been running in the wrong direction can be redirected. The question is deployment. The deployment protocol is not a product. It is not a specific instrument or vehicle or investment category. It is a structural logic. A sequence of positioning decisions that move capital from idle storage into correctly positioned operation, in the correct order, at the correct pace, for the correct structural reasons. Rockefeller did not deploy capital impulsively. He did not move from storage to position in a single transaction driven by urgency or opportunity. He moved methodically, evaluating each deployment against a set of structural criteria that had nothing to do with enthusiasm and everything to do with mechanics. The question he applied to every potential deployment was not, will this make money? It was, does this position generate return at a rate that exceeds the corrosion rate of holding the capital idle? And does it do so with a structural reliability that justifies the commitment of the position? The answer to that question is the deployment protocol, and it has 4 stages, not steps in a program. Stages in a structural progression, each one creating the condition that makes the next one viable, each one building on the one before it in a sequence that is load-bearing. The stages cannot be reordered. They cannot be skipped. The sequence is the mechanism. Stage 1. The position audit. Before a single dollar is moved, the current position must be mapped with precision. Not estimated, not approximated from memory. Mapped. With the specificity of Rockefeller's ledger, which recorded not just what capital was held, but where it was held, what it was generating, and what the gap was between its current return and its correctly deployed return. The position audit is the act of answering 4 questions about every dollar currently held. Where is it? What is it generating? What is the inflation-adjusted real return at that rate? And what is the opportunity cost differential between its current position and a correctly deployed alternative? For most people, the position audit will reveal a straightforward picture. The majority of capital is held in 1 or 2 accounts, a checking account earning near zero and a savings account earning below inflation. The inflation-adjusted real return on the aggregate position is negative. The opportunity cost differential is measurable and significant. This is not a discovery that requires sophistication. It requires only the act of measurement, of applying the arithmetic of the corrosion rate to the specific numbers of the specific position, and producing a clear statement of what the idle engine is currently costing per year. The position audit does not tell you where to move the capital. It tells you what the current position is costing. That number, the annual corrosion cost of the current idle position, is the number that the deployment protocol is designed to eliminate. The audit is completed before any deployment decision is made, not concurrently. Before, the sequence is, see clearly, then act. An engine that is deployed without a clear picture of its starting condition is an engine that may be moved from one form of incorrect position to another. The audit ensures that deployment is directionally correct before capital is committed. Stage 2. The emergency reserve separation. The second stage addresses a structural necessity that is frequently misunderstood, and the misunderstanding produces one of the most common deployment errors available to the person moving from idle capital to correctly positioned capital. Not all capital in a savings account is idle capital in the strategic sense. A portion of it, typically 3 to 6 months of fixed obligations, is emergency reserve. It is not positioned for return. It is positioned for access. Its function is not to generate compound return. Its function is to prevent the liquidation of correctly deployed positions under the pressure of unexpected expenses. This distinction is structural, not semantic. Emergency reserve capital must be liquid. It must be held in a position that allows immediate access without penalty, transaction cost, or the structural disruption of liquidating a position that was designed for duration. A savings account, for emergency reserve capital, is not an idle engine. It is a correctly positioned holding structure, because the requirement of the position is access, not return. The error is holding all capital in the emergency reserve structure when only a portion of it needs to be there. The person with $6,000 in a savings account who needs 3 months of emergency reserve at $2,000 per month needs $4,000 in accessible liquid storage. They need $2,000 deployed. Not all of it. The portion that serves the emergency function stays in the structure designed for that function. The portion that exceeds that requirement is idle capital, correctly identified by the position audit, correctly separated by Stage 2, and correctly available for deployment in Stage 3. Rockefeller never conflated the function of a reserve and the function of a deployed position. They were separate instruments serving separate structural purposes, held in separate positions, evaluated by separate criteria. The reserve existed. It was not large. It was not productive. It was not intended to be either of those things. It was the minimum liquid buffer required to protect the deployed positions from being liquidated under emergency conditions. Everything above the reserve threshold is the engine. The engine should be running. Stage 3. The deployment decision framework. The third stage is where the capital above the emergency reserve threshold is evaluated for deployment, and the evaluation follows a specific structural logic that protects against the most common errors available at this stage. The errors are predictable. The person who has identified idle capital and determined to deploy it is vulnerable to 2 opposing failure modes. The first is overcaution, the decision to hold the capital in the idle position indefinitely because no deployment option feels sufficiently certain, sufficiently safe, or sufficiently understood. The second is impulsive deployment, the movement of capital into a specific instrument or vehicle because its return profile is attractive, without examining whether the position is structurally sound, durable, and correctly sized for the capital available. Both failure modes produce the same result. The engine does not run at the rate the correctly deployed position would produce. Overcaution keeps it idle. Impulsive deployment moves it to a position that is either inappropriate for its scale or structurally unsuitable for the person who has not previously deployed capital and is building the knowledge base that more complex positions require. The deployment decision framework applies 3 criteria to every potential position. The first criterion is the return differential. Does the position generate a real return above inflation with structural reliability? Not a projected return, not a best-case return. A structural return, the kind that is embedded in the mechanics of the position itself, rather than dependent on conditions that may or may not persist. Broadly diversified equity instruments, at the scale of capital available, meet this criterion. They have produced real returns above inflation across every extended time horizon in the history of markets. They are not guaranteed, but they are structurally reliable in a way that idle capital in a savings account is structurally guaranteed to fail. The second criterion is duration alignment. Is the capital being deployed into a position whose time horizon matches the capital's availability? Capital that may be needed within 1 to 2 years should not be deployed into a position that requires duration to perform. Capital that will not be needed for 5 or more years can be deployed into positions that require duration, and those positions are precisely the ones that generate the compound return that the corrosion rate has been consuming. Rockefeller never deployed capital into a position whose time horizon was misaligned with the capital's required availability. He understood that a position entered at the wrong time or exited at the wrong time under the pressure of a shorter horizon need was a position that could not perform its structural function regardless of its underlying quality. Duration alignment is not a sophisticated concept. It requires only one question. When will you need this capital back? And does the position you are deploying it into perform correctly within that horizon? The third criterion is structural simplicity. At the scale of capital above the emergency reserve threshold, the range of $4,000 to $8,000, the deployment should be structurally simple, not because complexity is always wrong, but because complexity at insufficient scale does not add return. It adds cost, adds management burden, and adds the risk of decision errors that a simpler position would not have introduced. A broadly diversified equity index fund, deployed at this scale, over a 5 to 10-year horizon, meets all three criteria. It generates a real return above inflation with structural reliability. It performs correctly over the required duration, and it is structurally simple. One position, low cost, no active management required, the engine running with minimum friction. This is not the only deployment that meets the criteria. It is the deployment that meets them most reliably at this scale, with the least structural risk for the person who has not previously deployed capital. Rockefeller's first refineries were not his most sophisticated. They were his most viable. The minimum complexity required to run the mechanism and generate the output that would fund the next stage of the operation. The deployment protocol at this stage is the minimum viable refinery. It is not the destination. It is the proof of concept, the first running of the engine, the first observation of return, the first confirmation that the mechanism works. Stage 4. The return protocol. The fourth stage is the operating rule that governs the deployed position from the moment deployment occurs through the duration of its operation. It is the simplest stage. It is also the one most frequently violated, because it runs directly against the structural pressure that has kept capital idle in the first place. The return on a correctly deployed position must be returned to the position, not treated as income, not treated as a reward for the discipline of deployment, not consumed at the point of generation, however modest the generation is in the early stages. Returned to the base, fed back into the engine, increasing the mass of the position, expanding the base on which the next period's return is calculated. This is the operating principle of the compound engine. The return is not output. It is input for the next cycle. The engine produces fuel as it runs, and that fuel must be fed back into the combustion cycle rather than extracted and stored separately. The engine that runs and returns its output to itself does not run at a constant rate. It accelerates, slowly, then visibly, then at a rate that eventually exceeds the contribution of additional capital from outside the position. At the scale of the initial deployment, the return is modest. At 7% annually on $2,000, the return in year one is $140. This does not feel significant. It is not yet significant in absolute terms. But it is the first output of the running engine, the first evidence that the mechanism is not theoretical but operational. That $140 return to the base becomes part of the year 2 calculation. The year 2 return is calculated on $2,140. The year 3 return on a slightly larger base still. The curve is present from the first year of deployment. It is not yet visible as a curve. It looks in the early years like a nearly straight line. But the geometry is there, building beneath the surface of the statement, waiting for the duration that will make it visible. Rockefeller kept his ledger through all of this, through the early years when the return was modest and the curve was invisible, and the patience required to trust the arithmetic without yet feeling it was the primary structural demand of the position. He kept the ledger because the ledger showed what the feeling could not yet show, that the engine was running, that the return was being returned to the base, that the mechanism was operating correctly even before the output was large enough to change the texture of daily financial life. The ledger is the instrument of the fourth stage, not to track spending, to confirm that the return is being returned, that the engine is running, not idling, not being partially dismantled each time it produces output. The deployment protocol is complete when these 4 stages are operational simultaneously. The position has been audited. The emergency reserve has been separated. The deployable capital has been positioned according to the 3-criterion framework, and the return is being returned to the base. The engine is running, not at full capacity, not yet at the scale that produces the dramatic output that the compound curve eventually generates, but running, generating return, returning that return to the base, building the mass that compounding requires to separate from the line. This is the structural difference between the person who has money in a savings account and the person who has capital in position. The first has an idle engine. The second has a running one. The difference between the two positions, held for 10 years with consistent additional input and uninterrupted return to base, is not a marginal difference. It is the difference between a position that has been slowly corroded by the stillness of incorrect deployment and a position that has been compounding at the rate the mechanism is designed to produce. The arithmetic does not adjust for the years already spent in the idle position, but it begins immediately and without delay from the moment the engine starts. The engine has been described, not as a metaphor that flatters you into feeling sophisticated, as a mechanism with specific components, a measurable corrosion rate, a calculable cost of idleness, and a deployment sequence that moves the position from deteriorating storage into correctly positioned operation. You now know what your savings account is doing, not what it appears to be doing. Preserving responsible savings, maintaining a balance that represents months of discipline. What it is structurally doing. Corroding. Losing purchasing power at the inflation differential rate, foregoing the compounding return that correctly positioned capital would be generating, drifting year by year further from the threshold at which the compound engine engages with sufficient mass to become the dominant force in the position's growth. The corrosion does not stop because you are now aware of it. The idle engine does not start because this has named it. The mechanism responds only to deployment, to the specific sequential act of moving capital from incorrect position into correct position, returning the return to the base, and allowing the running engine sufficient time and undisturbed operation to produce the output that the idle position has been consuming through stillness. If nothing changes, the arithmetic continues. Not as a threat, as the natural consequence of a mechanism operating exactly as it is designed to operate. The savings account will continue to pay its 2%. The inflation rate will continue to extract its 4%. The opportunity cost will continue to compound on the foregone return of every year the engine remains idle. The balance statement will continue to show nominal growth. The real position will continue to deteriorate beneath the nominal surface. 3 more years of responsible saving into an idle position will produce 3 more years of responsible corrosion. The discipline is not the problem. The discipline has never been the problem. The engine is the problem. And the engine is not waiting patiently for you to be ready. It is sitting still, corroding.